Everything is connected. Nothing is random.
There's a file in the French National Archives that no one talks about. It contains 17 names, 17 separate disappearances, different countries, different decades, different circumstances. For over 40 years, no one connected them. Because on paper, these cases had nothing in common. A dock worker in Marseille, a woman who died in a fire in Buenos Aires, a mathematics professor who walked away from his life in Paris. None of them knew each other. None of them disappeared in the same way. But there was something invisible, something that only became clear when someone finally looked at the documents themselves. Not the names on the documents, not the photographs, not even the dates, the paper. At first, none of these cases seemed related. April 1962, the port of Marseille. A man named Yusuf Ben Ali arrived at the passenger terminal carrying a single canvas bag. He was Algerian, 34 years old. He had a ticket for a cargo ship bound for South America. He passed through French immigration without incident. His passport was stamped. The date was recorded, April 14, 1962. There's a notation in the logbook, his name, his destination, everything routine. He boarded the ship, and then he vanished. No body was ever recovered. No arrest was ever made. No record of entry into any South American country was ever found. But here's what made the case strange. According to French immigration records, Yusuf Ben Ali never left France. The exit stamp was in his passport, yes, but there was no corresponding entry stamp anywhere else. Not in Argentina, not in Brazil, not in Uruguay. The ship's manifest listed him as a passenger, but crew members, when questioned months later, couldn't remember him. One said he thought a man matching that description had disembarked early in Morocco. Another said he'd never seen him at all. The passport itself was examined. It appeared legitimate, French issued, proper typography, proper seals. But when French authorities requested the original application file, it didn't exist. There was no record of Yusuf Ben Ali ever applying for a passport. In 1963, the case was closed. The official conclusion was administrative error, a clerical mistake. Someone stamped the wrong document or filed the wrong name. It happens sometimes, especially in the chaos following Algerian independence. The file was archived. No one questioned it further, because at the time there was no reason to think it was part of something larger. What investigators didn't notice was that the passport had peculiarities, small ones. The paper stock was slightly thicker than standard French documents from that period. The serial number along the edge used a typeface that was close to official standards, but not exact. These were details that meant nothing on their own, but they were there. 12 years later, Buenos Aires. On the night of August 9, 1974, a residential building in the San Telmo neighborhood caught fire. 3 people died. One of them was a woman named Maria Lopez. She was identified through documentation found in her apartment, a Spanish passport, an expired residency permit, a lease agreement signed in her name. The body was burned, but not beyond recognition. The autopsy listed her approximate age as 42. Cause of death, smoke inhalation. She was buried in a public cemetery. The case was considered resolved. Then someone in the municipal records office noticed something. According to official Spanish records, Maria Lopez had already died 6 years earlier, in 1968, in Madrid, from tuberculosis. The death had been registered, a certificate had been issued, the body had been buried in a Catholic cemetery outside the city. So who was the woman in Buenos Aires? Authorities requested fingerprint records from Spain. When they arrived, they didn't match, not even close. 2 women, same name, same approximate age, same nationality, but different fingerprints, different deaths, different graves. The Spanish government reviewed its own files. The 1968 death certificate appeared legitimate, signed by a doctor, countersigned by a municipal official, everything in order. The Argentine government did the same. The 1974 death certificate was equally legitimate. Both women had documentation. Both deaths had been processed through official channels. Investigators proposed a simple explanation: homonymy. Two people with the same name. A coincidence. It wasn't satisfying, but it was plausible. And without a clear indication of fraud, the case was closed. What investigators didn't notice was the paper stock used on the Argentine residency permit. It was slightly thicker than standard Argentine documentation from that period. The ink had faded in a way that didn't match the age of the document. These were small details, meaningless on their own, but they were there. There was one detail that seemed insignificant at the time: the serial number printed along the edge of the residency permit. The number 3 had a slightly flattened curve. The number 7 had a shorter horizontal stroke than it should have. No one thought to examine it closely. 16 years earlier, Paris, October 1958. A mathematics professor named Henri Dubois left his apartment in the 5th arrondissement one morning and never returned. He was 47. He taught at a secondary school. He lived alone. He had no immediate family. His colleagues reported him missing after he failed to appear for classes for 3 consecutive days. Police searched his apartment. Everything was still there: his clothes, his books, his identification papers. No signs of struggle, no note, no explanation. The case remained open for 2 years. Then, in 1960, it was marked inactive. But there was something strange that happened during those 2 years. A French diplomat stationed in Tel Aviv sent a brief memo to the Paris police. He'd encountered a man in a cafe who spoke French with a Parisian accent. The man looked remarkably similar to the photograph of Henri Dubois. The diplomat approached him, asked if he was French. The man said no. He gave a different name. He said he was from Alsace. He worked as an electronics technician. The diplomat noted the details and filed the report. It went into the case file. When investigators followed up, they requested documentation from Israeli authorities. The identity papers were examined. Different name, different profession, born in Strasbourg, not Paris. But there were similarities: same age, same height, same build. Both men had a documented heart condition, mitral valve prolapse. It wasn't proof. It wasn't even close. Israeli authorities declined to pursue the matter further. They stated that the individual in Tel Aviv was a legal resident with valid documentation. The case was closed. But here's the thing. The identity papers examined by Israeli authorities had been issued in France in 1946, just after the war. And when French officials requested the original application file, it couldn't be located. It would take decades for this to make sense. For years, these cases existed independently. They were filed, archived, forgotten. But in the early 1990s, a Claire Moreau investigator began reviewing cold cases involving unexplained disappearances. She wasn't looking for connections. She was simply compiling data for a study on missing persons. And she noticed something. In 17 cases, spanning from 1945 to 1970, there were documents that didn't quite fit. Not obviously forged, not amateurish, but off. The typography was slightly inconsistent with official standards. The paper stock was thicker in some cases, thinner in others, but never quite right. And there was something else, something almost invisible. In 12 of the cases, the side numbering on passports, the serial codes printed along the edge, used a specific typeface. It was close to the official font, but not exact. The number 3 had a slightly flattened curve. The number 7 had a shorter horizontal stroke. These were microscopic differences, meaningless unless you were looking for them. But once you saw them, You couldn't unsee them. Moreau contacted document examiners in Germany, Belgium, and Spain. She sent samples, asked them to compare. They all came back with the same conclusion. These documents had been produced using the same methods, the same tools, the same source materials, which meant one thing: they were all made by the same person. At the time, none of these cases seemed related, but that's how it was designed, because the people who disappeared didn't want to be found, and the person who made it possible had spent decades ensuring that no one would ever connect the dots. His name was Adolfo Kaminsky. Kaminsky was born in Argentina in 1925. His family was Jewish, Russian émigrés. They moved to France when he was a child. When the Nazis occupied France, Kaminsky was 18 years old. He had a rare skill. He understood chemistry, specifically the chemistry of ink and paper. He joined the French resistance, not as a fighter, as a forger. He made false papers, identity cards, ration books, work permits, documents that allowed Jews to move through occupied France without being arrested. He was good at it, exceptionally good. After the war, he kept going. He forged papers for refugees, for displaced persons, for people fleeing communist Eastern Europe, for Algerian independence fighters, for deserters from the French military, for anyone who needed to disappear. He didn't ask questions, he didn't judge, he simply made the documents. It's estimated that Kaminsky produced over 14,000 false identities over the course of his life. He was meticulous. He used the same techniques, the same paper sources, the same chemical processes for aging documents. He reproduced official stamps using hand-carved rubber and dental plaster. He matched inks by mixing his own formulas. But he had a flaw, a tiny one. When he printed numerical codes, serial numbers, dates, identification codes, he used a specific typewriter, a Remington with a slightly damaged key. The number 3 always printed with a faint smudge at the base. The number 7 had a hairline crack in the horizontal stroke. He probably never noticed it, and for decades no one else did either. But it was there in every document he made. A signature, invisible unless you knew what to look for.
So what does this mean for the cases? Yusuf Ben Ali, the man who disappeared in Marseille. His passport was real, but his identity wasn't. The passport had been issued by the French government, but it had been requested using a false application, a birth certificate that didn't match any official record, a supporting document that listed an address that didn't exist. Kaminsky had made those documents, and the French bureaucracy, overwhelmed in the aftermath of Algerian independence, had processed them without question. Yusuf Ben Ali boarded that ship, but the person who disembarked in South America wasn't Yusuf Ben Ali anymore. He had a different name, different papers, a different life. Maria Lopez, the woman who died twice. One of those identities was false, possibly both. The woman who died in Madrid in 1968 may never have existed. The death certificate was real, but the person it described was not. The woman who died in Buenos Aires may have been living under a false identity for years. She had documentation, she had a history, but none of it was real. Henri Dubois, the professor who vanished. He didn't die in Paris. He left, willingly. The man in Tel Aviv wasn't just Dubois. He was Dubois, living under a new name with papers that made it official. There was no crime, no abduction, no murder, just paper and chemistry and bureaucracy. What's disturbing isn't that these people disappeared, it's that they disappeared legally. Kaminsky's work was so precise that governments accepted it as truth. Immigration officials stamped his passports, municipal clerks filed his birth certificates, police officers verified his identity cards. These people passed through official systems, they were processed, recorded, archived, and then they vanished. Not physically, administratively. Because the systems designed to track people Immigration, vital records, national registries relied on documents, and documents could be made. Kaminsky worked alone. He had no organization behind him, no network, no infrastructure, just skill and time. And for over 40 years, no one noticed. Not because the forgeries were perfect, they weren't. There were flaws, small inconsistencies, details that didn't quite fit. But no one was looking. Because these cases were investigated in isolation, a missing person in France, a death in Argentina, an unidentified man in Israel. They were separate problems, separate files, separate jurisdictions. There was no international database, no centralized system for verifying documents, no way to compare a passport issued in Paris with one issued in Buenos Aires. So, the connections remained invisible, until someone finally looked at the paper.
Kaminsky died in 2023. He was 97 years old. He gave a handful of interviews late in his life. He talked about the war, about the resistance, about the people he'd saved. But he never gave a full accounting of everyone he'd helped. He never revealed how many identities he'd created, how many people had used his work to disappear. He said it wasn't his place to tell. Those were other people's secrets. So we don't know the full extent. We know about 17 cases. Maybe there are more. Maybe there are hundreds. We know that his methods were replicated, that other forgers learned from him, that the techniques he developed were passed on. We know that even now, decades later, there are people living under identities he created, people who left their old lives behind, people who are officially someone else. And we know that the systems we use to track identity, passports, birth certificates, national registries, are only as reliable as the documents they're based on. Kaminsky proved that those documents can be made, that they can be made well enough to fool governments, well enough to erase someone completely. And if it was possible then, with typewriters and dark rooms and hand-mixed ink, what's possible now? Think about it for a moment. In the mid-20th century, before computers, before digital databases, before biometric scanning, a single person with chemistry knowledge and a typewriter could make someone vanish from official existence. Not by killing them, not by hiding them, by giving them new paper. The systems that were supposed to prevent this, immigration controls, vital statistics offices, police records, all functioned exactly as designed. They checked documents, they verified stamps, they filed reports. But they never questioned the documents themselves. Because why would they? What Kaminsky understood better than anyone was that identity isn't who you are, it's what the paper says you are. And if the paper is convincing enough, the system accepts it. It doesn't matter if the person behind the document is real or not. It doesn't matter if the story is true. What matters is that the document looks right, that it has the correct stamps, the correct signatures, the correct typography. The 17 cases that were eventually connected, Youssef Ben Ali, Maria Lopez, Henri Dubois, and 14 others, weren't unusual. They weren't exceptions. They were just the ones that got noticed. How many others never did? How many people disappeared using Kaminsky's work and were never questioned, never investigated, never even missed? We can't know. Because the whole point was to leave no trace, to create a bureaucratic reality that was accepted as truth. And it worked. For decades, it worked perfectly.
There's something else worth considering. Kaminsky didn't work for profit. He didn't charge for most of the documents he made. He did it because he believed people had the right to escape, to start over, to become someone else if they needed to. But his work didn't discriminate. It couldn't. A forged passport doesn't know if it's being used by a refugee fleeing persecution or by someone fleeing justice. A false identity doesn't distinguish between a person in danger and a person who's dangerous. Kaminsky made documents for people who needed to disappear, But he couldn't control what happened after they disappeared. Some of the people he helped were resistance fighters, Jewish families fleeing the Holocaust, political dissidents escaping authoritarian regimes. But others? We don't know. The nature of the work means we can't. And that's the uncomfortable part. Because when you create a system that allows people to vanish, you can't choose who uses it. You can't guarantee that everyone who disappears deserves to, or that everyone left behind deserves the uncertainty. Administrative erasure is neutral. It doesn't care about motive. It just works. There's a file in the French National Archives that no one talks about. 17 names, 17 disappearances. They're still listed as unresolved, because officially those people never existed. Or they did exist, but they're gone now. Or they existed twice. Or they're still out there, somewhere, under a different name. The documents say one thing, the truth says another. And in the end, the only thing we can be certain of is this. If someone wants to disappear, if they have the right help and the right papers, they can. Legally, completely, forever. And no one will ever know they're gone.